Welcome to Part 4, Zoning Reform. What does it mean and what could it look like? Exploring the spectrum of opportunities together. For those that are just tuning in, this is part of a multi-part series focused on building a greater collective understanding of Gallatin County's planning framework and development review processes. The public has always played an integral role in shaping planning processes in Gallatin County, and this series just aims to share some important information to empower the public to engage in these conversations. Part 1 of this series is the introduction. Part 2 provides an overview of the various types of review in the county for new development and land use changes. Part 3 provides an overview of the planning framework with examples of some of the known challenges. In this part 4 is focused on solutions. So we'll introduce the concept of zoning reform, what it is, and the range of options that could be available for the county to consider to address some of the challenges that were discussed in Part 3. Before we dive into zoning reform, let's start with a quick overview of zoning and some of the challenges that have led us to the need to discuss zoning reform as a community. Zoning is a locally developed land use regulation that makes local review of proposed construction and land use possible. It is the reason that communities can provide public comment on certain uses when they're proposed and allow the planning department to check proposals for building or uses to minimize impacts on neighbors, wildlife, agriculture, or public health and safety. Zoning allows for local decision-making about the range of uses and development types that are appropriate in an area and provides a mechanism to ensure that any impacts to public health, safety, wildlife, agriculture, and the natural environment can be mitigated. Because the zoning regulations themselves are actually developed at the local level, the development of the regulations themselves and the content is done in the public sphere with opportunities for public engagement. Many existing zoning districts were actually initiated by residents in response to or in anticipation of some proposed use that they felt would threaten their quality of life. Without zoning in place, there's no mechanism to prevent uses that might create impacts or to allow public hearings to consider such uses, even in residential areas, unless that is part of a proposal to lease or rent 4 or more units and does not pay the lodging tax, or unless there's a subdivision occurring. Part 3 of this series contains really detailed information on how regulations like subdivision and buildings for lease or rent address certain things but not others, and the gaps that are addressed by zoning. So if you want to dig in to more information on that, just check out Part 3. All zoning is always established through a public engagement process and a public hearing process. Without zoning, things like motocross facilities, amusement parks, and resorts don't require any local review aside from things like well and septic approvals. Zoning review can only occur where a zoning district has been established. Zoning typically contains standards for density, a list of appropriate uses, and a list of some uses that might be appropriate if they are carefully designed to mitigate their impacts and include some opportunities for public comment. Those are known as like conditional uses. These aren't just rules. The purpose of these standards are really to prevent impacts to existing properties resulting from noise or light pollution, privacy concerns from buildings being too close to property lines, traffic impacts, or impacts to wells, as in something that could occur if, for example, someone built a home that exceeded the approved septic capacity. Zoning contains verification checks to before something is built to review to make sure what's proposed matches any other approvals or requirements related to the property. The pre-construction review can prevent people from inadvertently building in a restricted or hazardous area, which is valuable for the current or future property owners or occupants. If purchasing or occupying a building in an area without zoning, to get those same kind of outcomes, you would need to rely on your builder or designer to independently verify and comply with things like property boundaries, easements, well and septic permits, and a variety of other constraints that might apply to a given property, or otherwise be prepared to check yourself for those things. So those things are all checked through the land use permit process, which is one of the first things required before you build, and it's part of what is required by zoning. You'd also have to trust that your neighbor's builder did so as well, and trust that current and future neighboring property owners will sort of voluntarily consider how to avoid unwanted impacts to surrounding properties, wildlife, natural resources like water, or enact accordingly. Zoning consists of both the written regulation and the map. So in zoning, you will often hear the terms like district and subdistrict. A zoning district refers to the entire geographic area that a complete regulation applies to. So that's the dotted line that you see on the slides surrounding the green and blue areas. And the subdistricts are the smaller shapes that you see inside. So each district has their own set of definitions and procedural requirements. And then the subdistricts, for instance, mixed use or suburban or rural residential, those are examples of subdistricts. The subdistricts are the part of zoning that is tailored with specific standards and requirements based on locally relevant conditions assigned to specific areas. So why are we talking about zoning reform? Zoning serves a really important purpose in the county. However, our current landscape of districts and regulations has some real challenges. For a deeper dive on those challenges and to understand kind of how we got there, check out part 3. Gallatin County's current system of land use regulations is really complex. It's inefficient to administer, and it leaves many areas of the county unprotected. So in general, we have 22 separate districts or completely separate regulations operating independently from one another. Many of these were established over the decades, many are outdated, and since they operate independently, they need to be updated through separate processes, which involves many redundant steps and can be a very inefficient process. This makes it unnecessarily costly to taxpayers to do things that are generally expected to be done on a regular basis. In addition, 74% of privately owned land in the county's planning jurisdiction is actually unzoned. And with growth pressures and new uses emerging all the time, requests for new districts are likely. If we don't course correct soon, the way we've been doing things, as growth pressures persist, today's challenges will almost certainly continue into the future and be exacerbated over time, because as the number of districts increase, all of these challenges that you see on the screen kind of increase as well. So exploring zoning reform options together through open and honest conversations is really critical to make sure that we look at these as a community and address these issues and efficiencies. So going forward, we can have a system that really works best. Some of the opportunities that could be addressed through zoning reform are on this slide, and we know that these are the things that haven't been identified. There may be others. So every public engagement opportunity you see is an opportunity to highlight things that we may not be aware of. But given these challenges, zoning reform is an opportunity to improve generally fairness, predictability, and consistency across our land use regulations. For example, it offers the opportunity to reduce costs to taxpayers through improved efficiency of administration of our 22 districts and being able to really make updates when they're needed. There's also the opportunity to deliver protections afforded by zoning to new areas without exacerbating the known issues associated with the sheer number of districts that we have. It's an opportunity to be proactive versus reactive in terms of land use planning. So let's make sure we're addressing things before we end up in a situation where we really feel like it's needed to protect something. And along with all these, we have the opportunity to make sure what we're doing maintains the character of existing zoning regulations. We have many regulations in the county that are very well loved and very thoughtful. And so there's no reason to lose the good things that we have. All of these discussions, anything that would change in zoning always involves public feedback and goes through the public hearing process. So this is really an opportunity for us to put our heads together in terms of how we address these things and hopefully end up with a result that works a lot better than things are working now. The range of possibilities for zoning reform is really broad, and this video is meant to be as a primer for future discussions. So we certainly are not starting out with all the answers. We have more questions than we have answers, but this is just meant to open the door to discussions that we can have as a community in some upcoming public engagement opportunities. So first, what could zoning reform actually mean? So Gallatin County has taken the approach over time of enacting kind of piecemeal zoning districts as interest has been expressed since the 1970s. The world is a different place today and conditions have changed. So this is really our opportunity to have an intentional conversation about how we want to plan for the future and how we can make things work better. Zoning reform is maybe different than some of the types of changes in zoning people might be familiar with. So we're not talking about targeted text amendments or changes in the various subdistrict boundaries. What we're really talking about is changes to the structure and function and approach for the overall zoning framework in order to address some of the challenges that we've discussed throughout this series. So that may involve things like a variety of things. It may involve expanding zoning to new areas or some consolidation of existing districts. It also could involve opting into the Montana Land Use Planning Act, and we're going to discuss these in more detail in the following slides. Regardless of the recommended path forward that comes out of this conversations that we'll be having over the next several months, any changes to our land use regulations will always involve public feedback and one or more public hearings. So on your screen, what you see is a table showing sort of the full spectrum of options that could be available for zoning reform, ranging from really less proactive in terms of land planning to more proactive and including sort of the full range of possibilities. However, each of these have trade-offs in terms of their feasibility and their ability to address some of the challenges that we've been talking about over the course of this series. At this least proactive end of the spectrum is having no zoning. But since we already have 22 districts, current law would actually require a citizen referendum and a vote to undo things that have already been in place. And doing that would leave the county with no established guardrails for what could be built, resulting in a higher chance of conflict between neighbors and very few mechanisms to impose sort of locally enforced development standards to mitigate the impacts of development and land use change. The second option is sort of staying with this status quo, or this sort of enacting piecemeal districts as interest arises, which we have discussed at length and really includes many of the challenges, has resulted in many of the challenges that we've been discussing. So that one's pretty straightforward. Option 3 would involve establishing a single zoning district covering the unzoned portion of the county planning jurisdiction without putting any sub-districts in place. So this would essentially be establishing an empty district that prevents the proliferation of new individual districts, and also developing a menu of options that would be created, and areas of the county could opt in over time by applying zoning from this menu of options to fill in the empty district as interest occurs. So for the 22 districts that are already existing, they would stay as they are structurally, but they could be updated over time individually as staff time and budgeting allow. Option 4 could involve a variety of specific actions, but really the focus, instead of enacting a single district over the remainder of the county, we would be focusing on a series of potential changes limited to the high growth areas of the county. So this could involve some expansion of districts or establishing new districts in some unzoned areas, along with some targeted refinements of the existing zoning in the highest growth areas, or some combination of that, but generally limiting the reform efforts to the high growth districts. Option 5 is to maintain the existing 22 districts and establish zoning, including the district and sub-districts, so fully zone the remainder of the land that is unzoned in the county under a single 23rd district. Option 6 could be a second phase of option 5, whereas, so after that 23rd district is established, each of the existing 22 districts could be approached to discuss annexation or merging into the 23rd district over time. So that could mean, of course, maintaining some uniqueness of subdistricts, but making sure everything's covered under a single district, ultimately, over time. Option 7 would involve establishing a single consolidated zoning district with various subdistricts countywide. So in some form or fashion, making one single district with all various different subdistricts for the entire county. And a final option would be opting into the Montana Land Use Planning Act, which is a relatively new state law that changes how development review is done by essentially front-loading the planning process and shifting many types of development review that currently involve a public hearing to administrative review or being approved by the planning department rather than how things are now. So it's a vast change, but it does result in a single district countywide zoning. So while these are kind of the full spectrum of options, not all of these are completely viable. So we wanted to present them just to see, the full range of possibilities that exist, but not all of them are possible based on state law. So we're going to focus on discussing just a few. So option 1 would really require individual citizen referendums and a vote to remove all districts, which is highly unlikely. And even if that did somehow happen, new requests for zoning would likely continue because that's what we're seeing now. Options 6 through 8 kind of result in the same outcome of countywide zoning, but for options 6 and 7, there's no legal way in state law to annex or consolidate or dissolve districts. So in order to do option 6 or 7, you'd actually have to have some change in state law. So neither option 6 and 7 are possible, so we're not going to talk about those. As a result, we're going to focus on the ones that are not grayed out, so options 2 through 5 and options 8. I just want to note that the public may also be able to think of and share additional options that are not represented on this list. This, again, is meant to start conversations, not end them. So we're looking forward to, at the end, we'll talk about the listening sessions where we will be looking for feedback from the public on some of these issues. So each of these options offer some trade-offs in terms of their ability to address some of the existing challenges we've been talking about. So just to explain what you're looking at, the column on the left contains the opportunities we identified earlier in terms of the challenges that could be addressed. And when you're looking across, these are the different zoning reform options. And I'm not going to display option 2 because if we're thinking about addressing the challenges, option 2 was things staying exactly as they are. So we know the challenges that are associated with that. That's how we have the things in the left-hand column. Each yellow checkbox that you see indicates something that's partially addressed, whereas a green checkbox indicates something that is fully addressed. So in terms of the ability to address the inefficiencies and inconsistencies resulting from the number of districts that we have and the growing number of districts that we could have, options 3 and 5 really prevent the proliferation of those additional districts because you're establishing a single district over the remainder of the county. So the maximum number we could have is 23. Option 4 has the opportunity to address some inconsistencies, but that's limited to the higher growth areas and still leaves many parts of the county unzoned. So potentially the number of districts could continue to increase under that option. Opting into the Montana Land Use Planning Act or LUPA would resolve this issue because you have one single district. The end result is one single district. In terms of the second item, so delivering protections afforded by zoning to new areas without exacerbating the number of districts, options 3 and 4 begin to do this, but in practice, for option 3, because the sub-districts would be enacted over time, and in option 4, because you're just limiting things to the growth areas, it would still leave parts of the county unzoned. And the challenge with this is, of course, it tends to push some types of development with greater impacts outside of the areas with zoning. So it could shift the burden of this kind of development to unzoned areas. Both options 5 and 8 would fully address this concern. So for some of the reasons in terms of zoning coverage, options 3 and 4 both partially address proactivity, where options 5 and 8 are the most proactive in terms of planning and land use. For improving fairness, predictability, and consistency, really we're talking about eliminating those kind of unintentional discrepancies between definitions and things of that nature across our district. So option 8 or LUPA offers the greatest opportunity to address those inconsistencies. The other options would still require targeted updates to the existing 22 districts to address that factor. As a result, the pattern is pretty similar for addressing the efficiency of updates and the associated cost to taxpayers that would be involved in specifically making those kind of regular expected updates, but to a large number of individual districts. I just want to note that all of these options would allow existing districts to maintain their unique local character, and all of these options would involve extensive public feedback in order to take the steps to implement. It's also important to note that all of these are challenges that the planning department is currently aware of, and there may be challenges from the public's perspective that haven't yet been raised. So it's important to consider those in order to determine the path forward. And again, towards the end of these, I'm going to highlight some opportunities for the public to provide feedback, because we really do want your feedback. The other piece of how you might consider evaluating and differentiating between, which of these makes the most sense, is, what are the primary challenges? How likely is it that some of these things could go forward? So all changes to zoning involve time, public feedback, and various outcomes that can be difficult to project. So this assessment really, to differentiate these, is limited to the unique challenges associated with each of these things. So the primary unique challenge associated with option 3 is that since the district would be created with no sub-districts and areas would opt in using a menu, it could take more time than some of the other options to result in providing zoning to different areas of the county. So this would still require an opt-in, which requires enough neighbors to be aware of the value of zoning, aware of the options they have, and be able to organize to request the establishment of sub-districts. Options 4 and 5 are really similar. They're, making changes to zoning always has normal challenges in terms of they take time and public feedback, and there's things that may be difficult to predict, but we don't see these as being unique relative to the sort of general challenges that are faced by any efforts for zoning reform. Opting into the Montana Land Use Planning Act would be a time-intensive option, and as a result could be quite costly. So in order to meet the requirements of the law itself, it requires a series of steps that is unique to that option. To expand on that a little bit, the Montana Land Use Planning Act, or LUPA, it's the result of a law that was passed in the state legislature in 2023 legislative session. This would represent a major change to how development review is done in the county, and it essentially focuses on front-loading the public engagement process. So to explain a little bit more, it's required of cities of 5,000 people in or more in counties with populations over 70,000. So for some areas, this is a requirement. For the county, it is not. So you may have heard talk of this because, Montana Land Use Planning Act is being implemented in certain other local jurisdictions. So non-municipal jurisdictions like Gallatin County that are not required to follow this do have the option of opting in via a resolution by the governing body. So in this case, the county commission. Opting in would require a really robust public engagement process in order to create a land use plan and an updated future land use map with a very, very specific list of requirements that it has to incorporate. The county would then implement zoning for the entire county, and that would include incorporating the areas with existing zoning into the overall single regulation. Once complete, this would then shift many types of development review from a process that normally requires a public hearing with public comment and an approval tied to a vote by the county commission to an administrative review. In other words, that means the application would be reviewed and approved by the planning department in accordance with those established plans and regulations that, of course, would take a long time to develop. So in the case of Montana LUPA, the public engagement focuses on developing these plans, and then it shifts many types of review from what typically goes in front of the county commission to the planning department using those plans. Public comment in that case would then be limited to impacts not previously considered through that really robust front-loaded planning process. So because several of these options involve expanding or establishing districts in currently zoned areas, one thing really important to keep in mind is that zoning itself is never a one-size-fits-all, nor should it be. So the county is extremely diverse in terms of geography, values, and expectations around the role of government and growth pressures. The type and characteristics of any zoning regulations, when developed, is completely customizable to meet the unique needs of communities on the ground. And it can be adapted considering growth pressures and what's important to the community and those localized conditions. So many people may be familiar with one certain idea of zoning, but not the full spectrum of possibilities. So there's a whole spectrum of possibilities that the community can consider, ranging from sort of lighter touch zoning, which can have really minimal permit requirements focused on public health and safety, pre-construction verification, or something that's really location specific that meets a community identified need. There are even newer approaches like performance zoning that, rather than focus on a list of specific uses, it focuses instead on standards tailored to avoid specific impacts. And then on the other end of the spectrum is more robust zoning. So that likely is what people are more familiar with, and that's seen in areas where properties are closer together, so the potential for impacts are higher. So at this end of the spectrum, zoning might include a full list of appropriate or conditional uses, really specific standards like building height, lighting guidelines, landscaping, parking, and more. So if the outcome of zoning reform discussions were to involve some sort of expansion or modification of districts, this would initiate a discussion with communities around the type of zoning that is most appropriate for their community and the specific content of the district regulations and map. So just to reinforce this point, it's important to note that the steps required to take action on any zoning reform or make any change to zoning are established by state law. The way changes are made is discussed in more detail in parts 2 and 3, so feel free to pause this slide or take a look at those separate videos for some additional detail. But briefly, any proposed change, whether it's expanding or establishing new districts or making changes to existing districts, required its own separate public engagement, public notice, public hearings. So that means the public will always have an opportunity to weigh in on these public engagement meetings, on public engagement meetings and in public hearings for any reforms, if such reforms do go forward. So at the end of this presentation, we'll share some opportunities for how you can get involved in these discussions around zoning reform. So the best way to address any challenges that we've highlighted throughout these series is through open and candid discussions together. To facilitate that, Gallatin County is hosting a series of listening sessions. In the county, we've always benefited from a really highly engaged community that gets involved in land use planning issues and public engagement opportunities. So on your screen, you'll see several dates in February and March. where we will host some listening sessions at the county courthouse. That's 311 West Main Street in the community room. There will also be a virtual option via Zoom for those who prefer to attend virtually. And the format of these listening sessions will really be an opportunity for people to share verbal feedback on their experiences. So we'll start with a brief presentation by the planning department, and then the remainder of the time will be open for public discussion around some guided questions. So join us at any of these listening sessions and let us know what you'd like to see from your local planning framework. I also wanted to point out some important ways to keep in touch and be informed about different efforts going on at the county, including for long-range planning initiatives. So at the top left, you'll see envisiongallatin.com. This is the host site for all of the information about this project and these listening sessions. So go there to find the links for the virtual presentations. You can also sign up for our email listserv at envision@gallatin.mt.gov. There are many ways to keep in touch through social media or by signing up for county newsletters. So feel free to pause this screen and follow whatever platform you prefer. And for those who prefer phone or in person, the Gallatin County Planning Department is always available by phone or in person during normal business hours. So hope to see you at an upcoming listening session, and thank you so much for your time.